If you're eating better, and that's more real food, and more real food costs more than fake food, well then combine that with fasting because you just need less of that real food. I think that's an intelligent view, and maybe we defend it. I would defend it as a kind of nutrient biochemist by saying by eating real food, you're getting so much more nutrition. It's so much more nutrient dense that you can metabolically afford to fast.
Insulin resistance is literally a topic my brain has been obsessing on for several years, but I feel like the last year it was really brought to light when we started seeing statistics that only 12% of Americans were metabolically fit. So I just want to start by throwing that out at you and saying, why are only 12% of Americans, and I know we have a worldwide audience, but why are only 12% of us metabolically fit?
Yeah. So that eye-opening study was based on looking at how well people did in the metrics of the metabolic syndrome. So they looked at waist circumference, blood pressure, blood glucose, and blood lipids, just to maybe lump those together. And they found that only 12% of US adults were good in all of those aspects. And in contrast, 88% failed one or multiple of them. So it's pretty sobering. And I like that you noted the international aspect to your audience. I have a great appreciation for this problem worldwide, insofar as my actual career as a scientist, in a way, started in Singapore, tucked away in Southeast Asia, where I did what's called a postdoctoral fellowship with Duke Medical School there, with the explicit purpose of understanding the metabolic disorders that are becoming so prevalent in Southeast Asia. I've given talks on this topic throughout that part of the world and the Middle East, which actually has worse statistics than we do. So as much as we think the problem's bad here, it's even worse in some other countries. So that certainly gives us the scope of the problem. But I might even add that this unique moment in time where people are more mindful of their immune function, then it makes insulin resistance even more relevant, where we know that in the midst of this current fear of a particular virus, those who have poor metabolic health are substantially orders of magnitude more likely to suffer problems from an infection. So now more than ever, not to mention the growing Alzheimer's disease and certain metabolic related cancers and heart disease, those are all relevant and always have been. Even immune system and our ability to fight off, to successfully defend against a viral infection, that makes this topic all the more relevant.
It does. And yet, why are we, people like you and me are bringing it to light? But I have sat around for the last year in awe while we had everybody quarantined inside, that the education on insulin resistance stopped. That cannot continue. We have to. Why is that? Is it lack of media attention? Is it big pharma, big food? Like, why aren't we bringing this to light for people?
Yeah. So in you asking that, I realized I didn't quite answer a part of your previous question, which was how did we get to where we are? And very, very briefly, it's because of what we eat. It's what we eat and how frequently we eat it. And we can get into those details later, but that really is at the heart of the problem. The food we eat is the culprit or the cure. And then in the context of the current concerns with immune health, I can only speculate. I can speak on, how we get to the problem very, very authoritatively with high, as a research scientist, but why lifestyle and overall and metabolic health continues to be overlooked, I can only assume there's just competing interests, and not to sound too cynical,
right.
but giving dietary advice doesn't make money. Yeah. And I'm enough of a capitalist to appreciate companies and the desire to outcompete another company and make money. I'm not saying, I don't mean for this to be interpreted incorrectly. Money can be a wonderful motivation, but it can also be a terrible motivation, or a motivation for all the wrong reasons. So I think the ongoing refusal to acknowledge metabolic health in the context of a viral epidemic, I can only assume there's just competing interests, and there's no money to be made by telling people that they need to watch their diet.
Yeah. So on the food, and I agree with you, I really do. And I think it breaks my heart, because, and this is why I love doing podcasts with people like you, so we can bring this to light. But do you think, on the topic of food, that we're in a situation where it's a little bit like, if you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and gradually raise the heat, it will die. I feel like that's what's happening to our food. Everything has changed about our food. Chemicals are in our food. Fats are different. But humans haven't figured it out. Do you feel like that's what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have been, like every organism, humans have an ability to adapt to their environment within reason. Like every organism, it's always within reason. Just like the frog can't immediately adapt to the boiling water, it would be lethal, of course. But within reason, the small, in this case, the small degradations or the small degrees of change, we can adapt. I think what we've done within the last couple generations is something that is totally unique in the history of humans and human nutrition, which is now, for the first time, we're getting very high fat and high carbohydrate foods. That doesn't exist in nature, really, with one exception, which is milk, where, like you imagine mother mammal giving a perfect food to baby mammal, and milk happens to be high in all three macronutrients: fat, carbohydrate, protein. That means it's a perfect cocktail for growth. But for those of us that are grown, you don't get fat and protein, fat and carbohydrate at high levels together. And I mentioned protein. What we've done is, of course, strip away the protein, because protein is very satiating. So it doesn't make sense for a food manufacturer to want to keep the protein in there, because that's bad for business, because then someone doesn't want to eat as much. And protein is expensive.
Yeah.
And so they can peel that protein off and do something else with it. Well, then that's just another way to make more money. So protein and carbohydrate and fat in nature would never come at a high level without some protein. But that's what we've put ourselves in, where we're eating foods from bags and boxes with barcodes. And that essentially means we're getting high fat, high carb, low protein foods. And tragically, it's the worst kind of carbs, which is refined sugars and starches, and the worst kinds of fats, which are refined seed oils. This is a total departure from an ancestral way of eating that we've put ourselves in very little time.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing from a lot of the public, this is why I love fasting so much, is because this is our food industry. But if I want to eat better food, I'm going to be willing to pay more. So, which is horrible onto itself. And so the way I've looked at this for a long time is that the only way out is to get people to start skipping meals and to start fasting, so that we can learn how to not put as much of this food in. Do you see another way for us to change that exact scenario that you just talked about?
In the context of food, and there are other inputs that affect insulin resistance and metabolic health, but food is the biggest, no question. Of all the levers we're trying to manipulate to get healthier, there are a bunch of them there. Some of them are slippery. The food we eat is absolutely firm. We can change that immediately. We can push it up or push it down based on what we're eating. I am a fan of fasting. I like the nuance or the context that you bring in, which is, if you're eating better, and that's more real food, and more real food costs more than fake food, well, then combine that with fasting, because you just need less of that real food. I think that's an intelligent view, and maybe we defend it. I would defend it as a kind of nutrient biochemist by saying, by eating real food, you're getting so much more nutrition. It's so much more nutrient dense that you can metabolically afford to fast, because you've gotten everything you needed in such a condensed or dense nutrient food stuff that you physically, metabolically, it's no problem if you now go 12 hours or 16 hours, because you are nourished. And it's in such stark contrast to where most people find themselves, which is they are overfed yet undernourished. And I kind of refer to that as like a misnourishment, where they get plenty of energy, plenty of calorie, which a human needs to survive. Of course, we have to have energy. Thankfully, we store a lot of it in our fat cells, but then you also need all of the other stuff that ought to come with nutrition as we're eating. So that's one benefit of intermittent fasting, no doubt. To me, as a metabolic and a fat cell scientist, I just have to emphasize that one of the best ways to improve insulin sensitivity is to lower your insulin. And there's no question fasting is the most effective, rapid way of lowering insulin. When you simply stop eating or drinking energy and calories, insulin has no choice but to start to come down.
Yeah.
So, as we look at a kind of microscopic level, you see that, I don't mean literally, but maybe in a small time frame, when someone goes to bed, they're not eating now for the first time in a long time. Insulin can finally start to come down because it takes several hours after eating for insulin to come down. During that period where insulin is at its low or fasting state, the body's becoming more insulin sensitive, and the body starts going into a more fat burning state because low insulin means higher fat burning. Well, if you can fast through that period or somehow prolong it, either by fasting through breakfast or fasting through dinner by just starting the insulin drop earlier, whatever way you do that on either end of the day, you've simply prolonged the period of low insulin, which means you're enhancing an insulin sensitizing state or allowing insulin to do its job a little better and stay at lower levels. But the tragedy is that someone has eaten a big dinner and an evening snack, and their insulin takes a long time to come down. Well, right around the time it's coming down, they're waking up,
Yeah.
and wouldn't you know it, they're ending their fast. They're breaking their fast with a starchy, sugary breakfast. It's bagels or cinnamon rolls or toast or cereal or orange juice, and that spikes insulin 10 times over where it had been. And it takes 3 hours to come down. And right around then, they're having their mid-morning snack and then lunch and then afternoon snack. And every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin. That's a wonderful way to never burn fat for fuel. And it's a terrible way to make sure your body is becoming more and more insulin resistant at every moment of the day.
So would you say that the most important meal to skip then would be breakfast?
That is a great question. In fact, Mindy, I'm not going to let you pin me down to that. Um, but that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Yes.
For the reasons I mentioned, which is you've been sleeping and it's already low, so just keep it low. And it's easiest because breakfast rather, is one of the less social meals we have. And that
Good
really
point.
matters. So
Yeah.
for me, well, not even me. There's a study that looked at cutting breakfast or cutting dinner. Cutting dinner yielded more significant metabolic benefits than cutting breakfast did. So that's the objective data. However, it's tricky to fast through dinner because that is the social meal. I'm a husband and I'm a father, and that matters more to me than keeping a six-pack in my mid-40s. So even though I know as a metabolic scientist, fasting through dinner is going to actually yield greater metabolic dividends than fasting through breakfast, I just can't fast through dinner. It doesn't work. I'm sitting at
Right.
home with my
Well
wife and
said.
kids, and so it doesn't work. Breakfast, in contrast, no, it doesn't upset a family dynamic at all if I fast through breakfast. Even though I'm with my family virtually every breakfast, daddy is in charge of breakfast. That's kind of the family dynamic. I'm there. I'm making crepes. I'm making egg muffins for the kid, whatever it may be. And my kids eat more carbs than I do. It's no problem to them if I'm not eating breakfast, I'm sipping on a cup of tea or something. It doesn't matter to them. The breakfast morning is so busy. People are coming and going. It doesn't upset a social dynamic in my home. And even more the case with lunch when I'm at work all the time. If I, so I, my, well, I don't want to get off topic. So, best bang for your buck would be fasting through dinner, but that is hard to do. So I'd hate for someone to leave our conversation and say, all right, Ben said fasting through dinner. I'm going to fast through dinner and only do it once successfully and never do it again.
Well said.
And so the fasting through breakfast is the easiest way to do it. Even if it's not quite as high dividend as fasting through dinner, it's still going to be wonderful. So if that's the one that someone can do, then do it.
And yet, if you're listening to this, maybe you don't have a family or you're like, I want to do whatever I can to lose weight. What I hear you say is then you're going to want to fast through dinner.
Yep, absolutely.
And why is that? Is it just you're going into bed without food in your stomach, less cortisol surge?
Yeah, yes, that's a great point. There could absolutely be this more pronounced flux or shift in hormones. Maybe when you're eating a lot right before you're going to bed, now it just takes the body a lot longer to clear it because your metabolic rate has slowed. Energy demands is just much further down. I actually think it's because of a permissive effect that comes in the evening I know for me personally, after dinner, evening is the witching hour. That is when I'm at my weakest when it comes to
Mm.
temptations and indulgences. I would look at something in the morning around breakfast and not even have a speck of temptation to eat that. It
So
it is
true.
totally unappealing. But if I put that same thing in the evening, oh my goodness, it'll take a Herculean discipline on my part not to indulge. And so if I have just decided I eat a big, heavy, hearty lunch, and then I'm done until breakfast the next day, well, then you're done. There's just no getting around it. But if I've eaten dinner and I can still eat and I'm kind of roaming the house, then I just start snacking. And that's the challenge for me, where if I because I don't fast through dinner, I really try to have a very big lunch. And so because I've found, not that everyone would feel this way, but if I only eat one meal a day and it's dinner as my only meal, then
Mhm.
I almost always overindulge at dinner, and I almost always end up snacking on stuff after dinner and go to bed full and uncomfortable and sleep poorly, and it sets me off for another round of trying to do that again. So I, more and more, as I'm learning more about my own habits, and again, this might be helpful to some, I try to have a big lunch. And so when I come home for dinner, I'm already a little full. And then it just makes eating a small amount of dinner so much easier. And it makes stopping after dinner so much easier than otherwise. But if I have that kind of hunger pressure growing throughout the day, and it kind of crests at dinner time, then usually I don't do it well. And so as much as I'm a fan of condensing an eating window and one meal a day in theory, for me, it doesn't work out that well, because if I'm only going to eat one meal a day, it's most certainly going to be dinner with my family, and then it just sets me up to fail. So I'd rather fast through breakfast, have a really big lunch, and then a very modest dinner.
Yeah.
So it's almost like I'm kind of coming down from my lunch, and it just keeps coming down through dinner because it's so modest, and then I just flatline early in the evening with my
And
insulin.
I love that. And actually, I've done that I like to vary my eating styles all the time and my fasting lengths. And so what you're saying, I actually did today. And I like that because when you get home, you're not like, okay, I'm going to break my fast. Get me the food. What do you mean
Hmm.
dinner's not on the table? Like there is an emotional and response to your meal at night that you don't typically have in the middle of the day.
Yep.
But I have to be very strategic at the meal I put together for lunch so that I don't crash. My energy doesn't crash. Do you find that? And if so, what meal do
Oh,
you put together so
for
you're
sure.
energized?
Yeah, for sure. I noticed that mid-afternoon is the hardest for me, where I start to get the most tired and my productivity would tend to go down. I just simply nip that in the butt by not eating carbs for lunch. I'm very, very strict at lunch. And that was a study published by David Ludwig's group at Harvard
Mm,
last year, where he looked at energy availability after. So basically, how much nutrient is in the blood after a high carb meal versus a low carb meal. And it was significantly lower in the wake of the high carb meal. And that might be why people get hungrier sooner after a high carb meal, because you've cleared the blood of all the nutrients. Insulin spikes up and it lowers glucose, lowers fats, lowers ketones. Now the brain is thinking, wait a minute, we're getting low on energy. We need to eat. At the
mm,
same time, the brain might be giving us a sense of fatigue because it's sensing the lower energy and thinking, oh, wait, energy's a little low. We need to kind of tamp down our brain metabolic rate, which would be manifest as a fatigue or a tiredness. So I eat a big lunch and I just make sure that it's a lot of protein and a lot of fat and very little,
mm.
or very smart about my starches. And that kind of reflects my three nutritional principles in general.
What would be, give me an example. Would you do like a big chef salad?
Yeah. So yeah, some examples. I'm not a big salad guy, but I'd be totally in favor of it. It's just that I don't really have the patience to make it on my own and bring it. That's not
Yep.
in my wheelhouse, and there's no convenient place nearby. So lunches for me is a mix of leftovers from the night before. Like today, it was a bunch of taco meat, just
Mm,
hamburger from the night
hmm.
before, that I just mixed with avocado and sour cream, and then I just kind of ate it by the spoonful. So a
Yeah.
pretty ugly, miserable little dinner, a lunch, but delicious and very nourishing. Other times, I go to this little hot dog joint near campus, and I get two big hot dogs on a plate with a bunch of mustard and sauerkraut, and I eat that, no bun. And then other times when I really need it to be convenient, then I will take a shake. And not to sound like a shill, but a couple of my brothers made a low carb meal replacement shake just for this purpose, which is when you're low carb, it's sometimes hard to have super convenient foods. And if anyone wants to learn more about it, I won't say any more than that, but go to a website called Get Health, and health is spelled HLTH, no vowels in health, but gethealth.com, and you can learn more about the shake and see my blog posts. And
yeah, we'll put it in the notes, because I actually think shakes can be really horrible or they could be really beneficial. So whenever somebody creates a good shake, that is an awesome tool.
And we're just sort of a shake obsessed culture for various reasons. One, they can taste very good, and two, they're just so convenient.
Very convenient.
And so depending on what my day is, now I don't think anything's a replacement for real good hearty food. That always ought to be the priority. But the fact is sometimes it just doesn't work. And the more you go low carb, the more you don't have convenient foods. And you can't just rip open the backs of the box or the bag of junk that you were about to eat for lunch. Real food doesn't come often that way. So for those that find it to be they're time pressed and they can't have planned their meal out or don't have time to hit the hot dog shop or the hot dog joint, well, then I think a shake is always a pretty good option.
Well said. What do you think's worse? Do you think sugar's worse, or do you think the bad fats are worse?
Oh my goodness. This, of course, you being who you are, the debate that's raging on this topic, most especially on social media. So here, I don't want to answer that definitively, but maybe let me just talk through it for just a minute and put some context here, and maybe that'll lead me to a conclusion. So the people who attack, so I do tend to fall on the insulin side of things. I think chronically elevated insulin is so clearly pathogenic, creating insulin resistance and all the problems that come from it, that it's very hard for me to say that refined starches and sugars aren't important. In fact, I have to just tip that way, simply because my scientific expertise is so strong that I know the data so well that I just have to say that. However, I acknowledge that there is robust data suggesting that high levels of linoleic acid consumption are also very pathogenic. I just don't do those kinds of studies myself, and I'm not as familiar with the research. So I have to fall on the refined carb side. Okay. But in the end, I think we're splitting hairs, because the fact is we're getting both.
Yeah.
I think if you remove one and the other, or if you remove one, you've essentially removed the other. Yep. Because when people are getting high refined starches, they're getting them from processed foods that are high refined oils. When someone's getting high refined oils, it's not that they're drinking a bottle of soybean oil. They're getting the foods that the soybean oil has been cooked in, which is always going to be a refined starch or sugar. Yeah. So in reality, we get them together, and there's really no pulling them apart. But if I had to pick one, just because I'm so much more familiar with the science, that I would have to just say, well, the refined starches are going to be a huge problem.
Yeah. No, well said. You're the insulin resistance specialist here.
That's right. I'm the carb insulin.
Yeah, I love it. And you know what I always tell people is, if I came into your house and I swapped out all your oils, I just poured the good oils in the bad oil bottles, you probably wouldn't even notice a difference in taste. So I do feel like some people are very insulin resistant. If they can't get that sugar craving under control, if we just start by swapping out their fats, we at least have a door in.
Yeah, in fact, but even then, Mindy, I think it's genius. The moment we say that, though, we're also immediately forcing them to toss out all the refined foods they're eating, which is such a culprit. Because if we're just talking about replacing their cooking oils, which would be huge, it would be huge, because it's not like these people are getting their carbs because they're making cake at home. They're eating, they're getting their treats from these stores. And so there's, in reality, there's just no pulling the two apart. But I like your sentiment. If we could just say, you know what, just use that olive oil or use that coconut oil instead. Yeah, but they're not cooking at home. They're eating. Yeah. Most of that stuff is coming from outside the home anyway.
Yeah. How would somebody know? One thing I've realized in just interacting with so many people is that we only look at insulin resistance if we have an obesity issue, or we're struggling to lose weight, or we've been given a diabetes diagnosis. But there are a lot of other signs that we are insulin resistant. To help our listeners understand, like, what are some of the other signs? Like, one time somebody brought to my attention and I was like, oh, I'd never even thought about this. If you can't go without food, you're metabolically unflexible, that those mitochondria are struggling. And that could be a precursor to you being insulin resistant. That might be the first sign. How do you feel on that?
Yeah, that's great. I love that you're bringing this up. And by way of context, if we're saying 88% of all adults in the US have some form of insulin resistance, well, then there is a gap there, because only about 60% are overweight or obese. So we have a portion of the population that don't fall into the overweight or obese category by current standards. But yet still would be failing some aspects of metabolic health. So how do we explain those two? Or what might be the less obvious signs of insulin resistance, to your point, rather than just, I have too much fat that I'm jiggling or pinching? One, that's a great one. If someone can't fast for 12 hours, that's a terrible sign. And in a way probably reflects insulin resistance and chronically elevated insulin, which always comes with insulin resistance. And if insulin is high, good luck burning fat for fuel. And that creates a problem with the person who's fasting, because if your insulin is high because you're insulin resistant, even when you're fasting, it's still going to be higher than ideal. And when insulin is high, you are in glucose or sugar burning mode, and the body runs out of sugar very quickly. And so if you can't go 12 hours with, and you're an adult as a fast, that's a problem. You need to wean yourself off of that starch and sugar and help your body learn to burn fat better. And then it's nourished and it senses it has energy because you're using your own fat for energy, which after all is why it's there. That can only happen when insulin is down. But beyond the context of fasting for or not being able to fast as a sign of insulin resistance, others would be high blood pressure. It is almost a guarantee, if someone has high blood pressure, that it is caused by insulin resistance. That is the overwhelmingly most common. And then other less very noticeable to the individual and more subtle would be infertility. Erectile dysfunction in men. There was a manuscript published a couple of years ago that the title of it is unforgettable. And it's something like, I just said it was unforgettable, but I'll get it wrong a little bit. I clearly forgot the precise words here, but it was something like, in its being memorable, it was something like, is erectile dysfunction the earliest manifestation of insulin resistance? And in a man, that is a reflection of the problem that's happening at blood vessels in insulin resistance, which is that there's insufficient vasodilation. And good luck getting an erection if you can't have blood vessels that dilate. That has to happen. And in women, the most common infertility is PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. And that is at its core a metabolic problem, insulin resistance. Now, this really plays in well to this immediate topic, which is you can have women with PCOS who don't meet the metrics of insulin resistance. They are lean and they look healthy. Even in those women, they have much higher level of insulin resistance at their fat cells than women who have the same body weight but who don't have PCOS. So even there, when they look like they're metabolically healthy, when you actually scratch beneath the surface, you find that they do in fact have insulin resistance. It's just subtle. It's not clinically evident, but with a little further scientific scrutiny, you detect it at the level of where insulin resistance actually starts, which I believe is at the fat cell. These seemingly lean, healthy women with PCOS have insulin resistance at its origin, which is at the fat cell. And that's very likely what's contributing to the polycystic ovary syndrome.
Yeah. And we've, there's another breakdown in how we measure health, is we think a number on the scale, or BMI gets tossed around a lot as that's the measurement for health. I can't tell you how many women in our community have struggled to get pregnant. They told their BMI was high. We show them how to fast according to their hormonal cycle, and within a month they're pregnant without even dropping any weight.
That's awesome. Yep, that's right. Yep, that's right. And that is a reflection, just like you said, where insulin resistance is not something that's so manifest on the scale. It often is, but that doesn't mean it always is. Even more the case with different ethnicities. That I like to joke that If you want to be really fat, you want to be Caucasian, because Caucasians appear to be able to be the fattest and yet retain some form of health. But when I was doing my postdoctoral work in Singapore, talk about a difference of body fat and body type. If you compare, if I had two men, one of Chinese ethnicity in Singapore, one of, say, European or Northern European or Caucasian ethnicity in Singapore, same environment, same diet, same culture in a way, even this eating the same food has a different response. But the Chinese guy, he's starting to experience substantial metabolic problems at a very mild body fat level. So he just looks a little overweight, and he's already suffering the metabolic health that would take the white guy, the Caucasian guy, obese levels to get to. So there's massive ethnic differences on how the body stores fat, and how pathological or pathogenic it is in kind of starting or contributing to this progression of insulin resistance to diabetes, hypertension, Alzheimer's, infertility, and so on.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd never heard that before. That's fascinating.